Ever stumbled on one of those health claims? You know, the ones that sound a little too good to be true.
Like, picture this. A new diet pops up and it promises like crazy weight loss, but all you gotta do is eat grapefruit and like think happy thoughts.
Or, okay, how about this? A personality test that's like, we can totally unlock your hidden potential. Just tell us your favorite ice cream.
Yeah, we've all been there, right?
And don't worry, this deep dive isn't about like calling out any specific claim. It's bigger than that.
We're giving you the tools to spot pseudoscience anywhere.
Because, let's be real, it can be really hard to figure out what's legit these days.
And that is where our expert swoops in to save the day.
Right. They dug into Science versus Pseudoscience. It's by Lilienfeld, Lin, and Emirati. And don't worry, we're going to break down the juiciest bits for you. Well, it's honestly more complicated than people realize. Like, even philosophers are still kind of debating the perfect way to separate, you know, real deal science from something that's just pretending.
It's less about like a hard rule and more about spotting a pattern of, let's just say, interesting choices.
Okay, so no easy button then. But we can learn to spot those, like, warning signs, those red flags.
Exactly. And one concept that helps here is falsifiability. Basically, this philosopher, Karl Popper, he said a good scientific theory has to be capable of being disproven.
Okay, so it's not about being right or wrong right now, but about being open to being proven wrong later. Like, is that what you're getting at?
You got it. It's about being willing to test your ideas and see if they hold up. For example, imagine someone says they've found this, like, personality trait that always means someone will be successful. A falsifiable test would have to be designed so that it could show that, hey, maybe sometimes this trait doesn't mean success. Maybe it even leads to failure in some situations. If there's absolutely no way to even potentially disprove it, that's a bit of a red flag, you see.
So it's like a good scientist is kind of, sort of, hoping someone will prove them wrong so they can get a better understanding, right?
Exactly. You're getting it. But even falsifiability, it's not a foolproof system, right? There's no such thing as foolproof in science. And that's why we look for a whole bunch of suspicious traits together, what some philosophers call a family resemblance to pseudoscience.
Okay, so let's meet these shady family members. Because the paper, it gives us 10 warning signs. I'm ready to take notes.
Great. So let's start with the overuse of ad hoc hypotheses.
So imagine someone says, I can totally predict the stock market using these tea leaves. But then their predictions, they totally flop. What do they say?
Oh, I forgot to carry the one.
Basically, they'll say something like, but I didn't realize the teapot was chipped. That messed up my reading. They just keep making excuse after excuse to explain why their claim isn't working.
Instead of just admitting, hey, maybe I was wrong.
Exactly. They dodge ever being wrong, which, like we just talked about, is super important to real science.
Good point. Okay, hit me with red flag number 2. What's next?
Okay, so the second warning sign, it's the absence of self-correction.
And what I mean by that is real science. It's always changing, like always. We get new discoveries, we tweak old ideas, sometimes we even toss out entire theories when we realize, whoops, we were totally off.
Like when everybody thought the Earth was flat, and then, nope, turns out it's a sphere.
Exactly. But with these pseudoscience ideas, they tend to stay the same. They never change. Even when there's like tons of evidence that's saying, hey, this isn't quite right.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get a feel for this. So we've got constantly making excuses and refusing to change your mind even when the evidence says you should. What else is there?
Right. So number 3 on our hit parade of pseudoscience red flags, evasion of peer review. So picture this. A legit scientific study, it's got to go through this, like obstacle course, right?
And it's other experts, scientists in the same field, who are the, like, judges. They're checking the methods, the results, literally everything. It's like quality control for science.
Makes total sense, right? Like a second set of eyes to double check your work. Or in this case, like a whole room full of expert eyeballs.
Exactly. And you know what often happens when these, like, pseudoscience claims, when they actually do make it to peer review?
Let me guess. It doesn't go so well.
Often not so much.
Yeah.
Which is why they love to, skip that whole process, go straight to the public. They'll publish their findings themselves, put it in a book, whatever. Avoid those experts entirely.
Oh, I've seen that. They say stuff like, oh, the scientific community is just scared of my revolutionary ideas. They're trying to silence me.
Classic. It's like a get-out-of-jail-free card, right? But really, it's just a way to avoid real scrutiny.
So real scientists, they're cool with, like, a good debate. They don't shy away from that.
They live for it. I mean, that's how science actually moves forward, Challenging ideas, having those tough conversations. And that actually takes us to red flag number 4, which is emphasis on confirmation rather than refutation.
Ooh, okay, break that down for me.
So instead of looking for evidence that might actually challenge their idea, pseudoscience folks, they just focus on the stuff that seems to support them. Like, they've already made up their minds.
Oh, it's like if you're reading reviews for a movie, right? And you only read the positive ones, even if the negative ones might actually tell you something useful.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And you know what? That actually connects to the next warning sign, too.
Ah.
The reversal of the burden of proof.
Okay, so instead of showing me the evidence, they're like, no, you prove me wrong.
Right. Bingo. Instead of giving you evidence for their claim, they want you to disprove it, which, let's be real, is kind of impossible.
Yeah. How do you prove that something doesn't exist, Especially when the goalposts keep moving, like, oh, you need more evidence. Okay, well, we'll just change what counts as evidence then.
Exactly. Total logical fallacy. Okay, let's move on to the absence of connectivity. So, in real science, a new idea, it can't just be some random thing floating out in space, right? It's got to connect to what we already know about the world.
So it can build on old ideas, maybe challenge them, change them up a bit, but there's got to be some connection, like a through line.
You got to, it's like, imagine you're building a house, right? And you want to add a new room. You can't just build it midair. It needs a foundation, a connection to the existing structure.
Otherwise, the whole thing's going to collapse.
Exactly. And speaking of shaky foundations, that brings us to over-reliance on anecdotal evidence.
Ah, yes. The old, well, my aunt's best friend's neighbor tried it, and it worked for them, so it must be true for everyone.
Exactly. Now, those stories can be compelling, right? But they don't have the same weight as, a well-designed scientific study.
Because maybe your Uncle Bob's back pain went away when he started wearing that copper bracelet, but maybe there's actually no link. Correlation doesn't equal causation.
100%.
Yeah.
Could be other things going on. Could just be a coincidence. And you know what often goes hand in hand with that? The old use of obscurantist language.
Ooh, big word. What's that one mean?
So to make their ideas sound more legit, more science-y, they might use all this complex jargon, these technical-sounding terms. But often, the terms don't even mean anything, or they're using them totally wrong.
So using big words to sound smart and hoping no one notices that they're actually full of hot air.
You got it. And the paper actually gives this great example with EMDR.
EMDR, that's like a therapy for PTSD.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's actually backed by tons of studies. It's legit. But some people who were really into it were using this very technical but ultimately meaningless language to explain how it worked on a neurological level.
So even if the therapy itself is legit, they were using pseudoscience to explain it.
Exactly. It just shows that these tactics, they can pop up anywhere, even in legit fields with real science behind them.
Okay, that's a good reminder. We gotta stay on our toes. Even if something sounds good, even if it's got all the right buzzwords, we can't just switch off our brains and believe it, right? What else should we be watching for? Okay, so it's not just about fancy words, right? It's about the whole package, how they're selling it. What else should we add to our BS detector?
You're right on the money. It's often about the way they frame the whole thing. So next up, we've got absence of boundary conditions.
Catchy. Okay, explain that one.
Real science, right? It always acknowledges that things can work differently in different situations.
Right.
Like a good scientific theory, it explains not just what happens, but also when and why.
The context.
Yes. But pseudoscience, they like to make these big sweeping statements that their idea will work for everyone every single time, no exceptions.
Oh, so it's like a miracle cure that's gonna magically erase all your health problems. Yeah, that seems kind of sus.
Exactly. No nuance. And then last but not least, we got the mantra of holism.
Okay, this one seems kind of tricky.
Yeah, it can be, because it often uses all this language about interconnectedness, which isn't always bad, right?
Right, in some contexts, that makes sense.
But in this case, it's used to, deflect criticism.
Oh, I see. So, how does that play out? Give me an example.
Okay, so say someone's promoting this diet, and they're like, you can only eat things that grow on trees.
Okay.
And you're like, but what about all the other nutrients humans need that aren't in, tree food? And they're like, but you're not seeing the whole picture. It's about, the energy from the trees, the connection to nature, and it just, goes on and on. It's so vague.
So you can't even argue with them because they've made it all about this, mystical vibe.
Exactly. They've moved the goalposts.
Right.
So we've covered a lot, right? But it's important to remember, these warning signs, they aren't a perfect test. It's not that simple.
Right.
Sometimes you might see a couple of these things, even with totally legit science.
So how can someone listening take all this and actually, like, use it? What would you say is the key takeaway here?
It's about cultivating that healthy skepticism.
Yeah.
When you bump into a claim, right, especially if it sounds kind of dramatic or like too good to be true, don't just accept it without thinking. You got to ask yourself some questions. Like, first up, who's making this claim?
Yeah, like, do they even know what they're talking about?
Exactly. Do they have the right expertise?
Yeah.
Are they being upfront about how they got their info, who's funding their research, all that?
So check the source, look for bias. Makes sense. What else?
Then think about the evidence itself. Is it coming from, like, solid research? Or is it just like my aunt's friend told me? Are they ignoring stuff that doesn't fit their narrative?
So basically look for the receipts.
Exactly. And finally, think about how they're presenting their claim. Are they using all that jargon to sound super smart, making excuses for why it hasn't worked before, getting all defensive when you ask questions?
So basically, watch out for all those red flags we just talked about.
Exactly. You got it.
This has been so helpful, seriously. I feel like I need, like, a whole new notebook after today. My brain is full.
Glad to hear it. It's really fascinating stuff, you know. And what blows my mind is that even when you know all these things, even the smartest people can still fall for it.
That is kind of wild, right?
Yeah, it's about the power of belief and all that. It makes you think about how important it is to be, like, really aware in this world where everyone's got an opinion and there's information overload everywhere you look.
Okay, yeah, that's deep. Lot to chew on. Well, thanks again for joining us on this wild ride into the world of pseudoscience. Until next time, folks, keep those BS detectors on high alert.